Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 26th. So, as you know, I had you watch Dead Poets Society. It was a book that was adapted from a screenplay that was done prior to the film's release. The film is set in 1959, 1960, New England prep school. I can't help but think of something like the Deerfield Academy when I watch this film. And one of the many themes the film examines is the power of poetry, which is why I wanted to assign this film in our poetry section. That said, we need to kind of contemplate what poetry is, which we will be doing after the break. But I thought the film would give you at least a little bit of a sense about how poetry can be life changing. That's not to say the film is perfect. There have been critiques of this film. Definitely, we see the objectification of female in this film. Definitely, we see cultural appropriation, Nwanda, in this film, and this idea of colonialism as they take over that Indian, or the boys take over that Indian cave. Definitely, we see classism. This is a very elite and a very privileged group. Um, but that said, it also is historically accurate for its time. It's also quite Caucasian, which again would be historically accurate for its time for a New England prep school. The theme of conformity versus individuality, the pros and cons of both. Now, you may or may not know the English poet, 1800s romantic poet, John Keats, and Mr. Keating, Mr. John Keating in the film is a play on John Keats. And one of the things that I like about the film is that we get to hear some poetry being quoted. And we will revisit one of the famous lines the in the film that also is a very famous line of poetry. The road not taken. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. However, I can tell you that line is a little bit more complex than the way it was presented in the film. In the film, the suggestion is that this is about the benefits of individuality. When we read the poem, which is oftentimes misread, I can tell you, we will see that it's less about the choice made and more about the choice not made. Hence the title, The Road Not Taken, and the regret and the concern about the choice that you don't make. But even though the film doesn't necessarily delve into that, the film does delve into the idea of what happens when you take carpe diem, the seize the day idea, too far. That you need to do it with intelligence. And we get some foreshadowing of this, obviously, with the telephone call from God, where Mr. Keating is basically saying that it would have been funny if it had been a collect call. Now, I don't know if you necessarily understand that joke. This was in the time before cell phones, where you had to pay to make telephone calls on public payphones. And if you didn't have money to make a call, what you would do is you would call the operator, and the operator would call the party that you wanted to talk to and ask that person would they be willing to take the charges for the call you were making. That was called a collect call. So that was the joke that Keating was making that you may or may not have necessarily understood. But the point that Keating was trying to make at that juncture was that you don't want to be too extreme. You need to be careful and cautious about how you push boundaries. And it's something that I don't think was really understood by our main character as we saw him struggle with his father refusing to allow him to act, which is his passion. And his response to that is to, and spoiler alert here, I hope you've seen the film in its entirety by this point, is to commit suicide. So that isn't necessarily the answer. But we do see the film end on a somewhat optimistic note, even though Keating lost his job. We see that a good portion of his class has taken his lessons to heart about trying to be an individual and not necessarily conforming to other people's expectations. And we see a very young Ethan Hawke there do that. And there has been some discussion about that male friendship that goes on, and that could there be some sort of homoerotic tendencies, that really the subtext with Neil and his father is that ultimately it's not that he wants to be an actor, but that he really is not able to tell the truth about his sexual identity. And he, unlike many of the other characters in the film, doesn't necessarily seem to be that interested in dating or in females. I'll let you decide whether or not you think that's a little bit of a stretch based on what you've seen with the film. But I think the film does a very nice job of sort of planting the idea of how poetry doesn't necessarily have a clear definition, even though the Robin Williams, Mr. Keating character says that the purpose of poetry is to woo women, and everyone laughs. And there is a certain level of truth to that, particularly with very traditional poetry and romantic poetry. We'll talk about romantic poetry. Romantic poetry doesn't necessarily mean romance in the way that it was used in the 1800s. It was more about nature and the celebration of nature. And this is where you get the greats of Byron and Shelley and Keats, who would be writing in that tradition. That, yes, poetry often utilizes rhyme, where the endings of the words have similar sounds, often utilizes meter, which is a kind of beat, often utilizes alliteration, where the beginnings of words have similar sounds. So poetry can be very musical, and in fact, I suggest that you listen to the sounds of poetry. If you've ever gone to a poetry reading, then you know that poetry can be subjective based on how the reader decides to read the poetry. And I've often said that poetry is very similar to a song lyric, but that unlike a song lyric, you're not supposed to just read the song lyric. You're supposed to hear the song lyric sung, and usually accompanied by instruments. But imagine if you were to just read the song lyric without singing it and without the accompanying instruments. What you could get is a great piece of poetry. Or you could get something that's very trite and formulaic as well, as we've talked about all semester long. Something that's written purely for, let's say, entertainment and profit. Not that there's anything wrong with entertainment and profit, but that the kind of poetry that we will be studying has a lot more depth to it. And some music, if you listen to the lyrics, has a lot of depth. We'll talk about this next class. Some doesn't. But I think you can expect that the poetry will be dense and compact. So good news, the poetry is going to be shorter than what we've done with reading dramas. But it will be very dense. So it requires multiple readings. And I know I've been saying this over the course of the entire semester, but this in particular, poetry has to be reread. And the 3-time rule is very appropriate here. The first time, just to hear the poem. And I suggest you read the poem out loud, or you have somebody read the poem to you so that you can hear it. And then the second time, when you are trying to decipher what's going on within the poem. And then finally, the third time, to refresh yourself before you're talking about the poem. Now, it turns out that we're not going to have time to write a paper about poetry. At this point in the semester, you should have submitted in paper number 1, and I should have returned it to you. So if you have not received paper number 1 by this point, please let me know. I'm in the midst of evaluating revisions at this point. And as you know, you all have the option of revising paper number 1. You just take my comments into account to do your revision, and you submit in the revision along with the original evaluated copy with my comments to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu by the ending of the semester. And what I'm hopeful is that you are thinking about paper number 2 at this point, where you have similar prompts talking about either canon or contemporary relevance. Or you could create your own essay topic. You just need to have the topic approved by me. And it has to be on one of the 3 dramas that we've studied. So either Oedipus the King or Midsummer Night's Dream or Raisin in the Sun. And now, of course, we're talking about poetry. And that means that we are going to go up until the ending of the semester, right up until the final exam, talking about poetry. So at the ending of the semester is when you hand in paper number 2 on drama, but there won't be time for you to write a paper number 3. But there will be time for you to take a final examination. The bulk of the final will be devoted to poetry. So what I'm going to do is just basically give you a series of essay questions. It will be open book, open note, and ask you to write about one or several of the poems that we've covered in class. So basically the best way to prepare for the poetry section is to have read all the poems and to have seen all of the class videos. That will be 80 points of your examination. That leaves 20 points. 10 points for a short story or fiction, I should say, and 10 points for drama. And that said, the questions will address either text or film or some combination thereof, but there will be choice within them. So again, the best way to prepare is to have done all the reading, seen all the films, viewed all of the class discussions, read all of your peers' class discussion forum responses, and my responses in turn. So if you're able to do all of that, the final is just basically synthesizing major points. And if we were taking this in a face-to-face situation, you would have approximately 2 hours to take this final. Because we are doing this in an online situation, I will give you 24 hours to take and submit in the final, and you would submit it via my email, the way you've been submitting in your papers. I don't expect you to spend 24 hours on the final. I expect you to spend approximately 2 hours or so on the final. Again, it's open book, open notes, and I don't expect anything as well written or as developed or detailed as what you would do in a paper, but I still expect that you could synthesize ideas and have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this is what we will be focusing on for the next few weeks. What is poetry? How do we read it? And how do we write about it? And if nothing else, I guess we could say that poetry is an examination of emotional states, which is very difficult to articulate into words. Think about looking up a word like happiness in the dictionary. You can get a definition, but it's pretty flat. The same with love or with fear or despair. And I think poetry tries to give us that definition. And some poets, Emily Dickinson is a great example, are particularly skilled at being able to express those emotional states. But as I said, we'll talk a little bit more about the preparation for our poetry section by talking about some of the readings that the textbook provides that unfortunately I have been unable to find as free links, but I'll be filling you in. And of course, the text is on reserve if you don't have a copy of the text itself. That talks a little bit about poetry and what it is and how we read it. And then when we actually start reading the poems themselves, luckily I have been able to find links so that I can share those with you. Some of those links include audio so that you can listen to either the poet themselves read their poem, and sometimes a poet is very skilled in doing that, and sometimes a poet isn't. It's almost like a songwriter. Some songwriters can sing their own songs, and some songwriters should not sing their own songs. And sometimes professional poetry readers will be reading the poems. Oftentimes these are actors. So the idea of a reading means there's an interpretive element, much like we were talking about with drama. And what you will notice in the poetry section for the poems that I've assigned is that occasionally, rather than giving you a page number, it says handout. And what that means is that that particular poem is not included in the text which I had ordered for you for this semester. So if you look in the syllabus and other documents folder, or actually, no, you don't even need to do that. I'm sorry. All you need to do is just look at the bottom of our notes here, and you will see the links for the handout poems. And those are The Sick Rose, America, Coca-Cola and Coco Frio, and The Hill We Climb. And of course, I will provide the links for the other poems as well as they become applicable over the course of the semester. But I just wanted you to have the links now for any of those handout poems that we would be doing. You can also see below that I've included a flyer for a class that I'm teaching in interpersonal communications. And very recently, it was the Surgeon General who had declared that isolation and loneliness has become an epidemic in the United States. And one of the questions that we pursue in this class is, could improving interpersonal communication skills help with that epidemic of isolation and loneliness? So if you want to know more about the class, do let me know. But this would be the time where normally I would talk a little bit more about poetry, but I'm well aware that we are on the cusp of Thanksgiving. And this would also be the time where I would normally ask you an attendance question. But there is no attendance question today because, well, Thanksgiving is right on our heels. So basically, this is my time to say, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, or at least better than I have been with my cold. And when we reconvene next week, we will put some closure onto Dead Poets Society and start talking about what is poetry and how to read it and how to write about it. I hope you have a very good Thanksgiving. Take care. Bye bye.